Nā mihi mahana kia koutou, ko Holly Thorpe, tāku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening everyone and welcome to the University of Waikato, Kaupapa Kōrero, focused on the Tokyo Olympic Games. The title of tonight's discussion is Faster, Higher, Stronger, Riskier, Power, Performance and Patriotism at the COVID Olympics. So my name's Holly Thorpe and I'm a professor in Te Huataki Waiora, the School of Health here at the University, and it's my pleasure to be convening this discussion tonight. And given the controversies leading into the Games and the mixture of excitement, confusion, frustration, even bewilderment, that seemed to be emerging during the Games, I have a feeling that tonight's discussion is going to be a lively one. And we have an awesome panel joining us tonight. This panel has been carefully selected to bring together a range of perspectives on this topical issue, including the voice of athletes, sports leaders, and researchers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panellist. Ali Wollaston is a University of Waikato Hillary Scholar and member of the New Zealand Women's Endurance Track Cycling Team. Ali is currently studying towards a Bachelor of Law and offers an elite athlete perspective today, so we're excited to have you here, Ali. Next up, we've got Dr. Damien Puddle. Let me give you some echo on that, all right. Dr. Damien Puddle, he completed his PhD here at the University of Waikato a couple of years ago now. Damien now works for Sport Waikato as New Zealand's first local play advocate. He's also the CEO of Parkour New Zealand, as demonstrated here, and also is the CEO of the international organisation Parkour Earth. Next up, we have Mihi Namani. Mihi is a PhD candidate at the University of Waikato with a prestigious Sport New Zealand doctoral scholarship. Mihi's currently a principal lecturer in sport at Manukau Institute of Technology, and she's researching sport sociology, particularly the intersection of gender and ethnicity. And in her PhD research, she's focused on the physical activity experiences of young Māori and Pacific wahine living in low socioeconomic communities. And on top of all this, Mihi's also a world champion bodyboarder and weightlifter. Next up, we have Jeff Barry, is the recently appointed Chief Executive of Rowing New Zealand, and this is following 9 years working at Sport New Zealand. Thanks, Jeff. He's also an experienced, obviously, sports administrator and a former elite coach. Next, we have Professor Belinda Wheaton, who is a cultural sociologist in Te Huataki Waiora School of Health, and she has interdisciplinary research interests spanning the sociology of sport, gender studies and issues of power and inequity. And she's also co-authored a new book with me, Action Sports in the Olympic Games, Past, Present, Future. And last but not least, we have Dr. Rod Townsend, who is a senior lecturer with us in Te Huataki Waiora, and his research focuses on coaching across the disability sport pathway, including elite and Paralympic sport. So a very warm welcome to our 6 esteemed panellists. Thanks so much for joining us this evening to share your thoughts and perspectives on the COVID Olympics. Now, we're here to have a discussion with our panellists, but it's very much, we would love to hear from you too, from the audience, to bring you into the conversation. So please, you can use Slido and you can add your questions there. You can like other people's questions, and those might be bumped to the top of the list. And I'll try to ask those at the end to our panellists so we can really open this up for a critical conversation. But before we kick off the discussion tonight, let's start with an old-fashioned poll. Can we put our hands up? Everyone put your hands up if you're excited about the Tokyo Olympic Games. All right. Looks like majority excitement, but some others not so much. So we're going to maybe a bit of a divided audience, which tells me I think we are going to have a good conversation this evening. Now I'm going to come over and join you right here. Get comfortable. So everyone on the panel this evening either currently is or was an athlete of some form or another, and we all know that any good sporting match begins with a warm-up. So I thought I'd start the kōrero tonight with a warm-up question. What are you most excited for at the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics? Now first, I want to paint a bit of a brief picture for us all. The New Zealand sent the largest team that we've ever sent to the Tokyo Olympics with 211 athletes representing Aotearoa in 21 sports. Almost half of those are women. We've got one more female athlete than we had in Rio. Just over 30% of the New Zealand team are Māori. And the New Zealand team also includes 28 Paralympians across a range of sports, including cycling, athletics, swimming, canoe, and wheelchair rugby. So across this group and the different forms of expertise we have here, I'm sure there's lots to be excited about. So who would like to start? What are you excited about for the Tokyo Olympics?
I'm excited for the surfing. To watch the surfing and the skateboarding, the new sports. They've been really exciting to watch, definitely, and just how it would integrate into the Olympics. So that's me. Yeah.
I love the Olympics because it's the one time when we watch sport that you get to see lots of minority sports that you wouldn't necessarily normally see at least on the mainstream TV, and that women do get really good visibility. We're so used to the sport on our TV being dominated by men's sport, so it's great to see that. And I share Mihi's excitement about the surfing, and I think the skateboarding, the women's, is just been awesome. I don't know if you got to see it yesterday, 3 first medals, and they're all teenagers, and they weren't from the US. People kind of maybe expected that they were going to be dominant, so it was like it when the underdogs, or the countries that you don't expect do well.
Definitely.
I guess I'm excited to see if it all goes to pop or not. I think given the issues that have preceded the Olympics and the Paralympic Games, and the issues around vaccinations and bubbles and athletes withdrawing from competition and all the various challenges that COVID's thrown at us over the last year and a half, 2 years, I'd be interested to see if the Olympics and the Paralympics survive.
Time will tell. Jeff, how about you?
I've sort of got 2 perspectives, I guess. I've got that competitive anxiety because we're going to 3 days of pretty important finals for rowing, and I might have a job at the end of it or not. So there's a competitive anxiety around that one.
Fair enough.
What excites me a little bit is the conversations that emerge because of all the things that people have been talking about here. The dialogue that comes around the social change that the Olympics may follow or lead. So I think that's pretty cool.
Thank you. Ali, how about you?
I'm probably biased, coming from a track cycling background, so I'm very excited to watch my teammates and everyone like that racing in the track cycling, and been along the journey with a lot of the girls racing. So it's quite inspiring to see my teammates going off and racing at big games. Makes it a little bit more achievable for me. I think, this is probably the first Olympics where I actually know a lot of people at the games. So for me, seeing my friends and fellow teammates at the games is really exciting, and pretty new concept for me. So excited to watch my teammates.
To have that personal connection really does change the experience. Even I live in Whangaroa and Raglan, and one of our local surfer lads, Billy Stearman, was at the games, and it definitely changed the whole family experience watching when you have a local, someone that you know who you see in the street, or your friends can be there. Yeah. What about you, Daniel?
Like Belinda, I think I'm excited with the smorgasbord of sport that you get that is made available. But perhaps like Rob, I maybe wouldn't use the word excitement, but I'm interested to see what happens because of all of these things that are happening in and around the Olympic movement, and therefore the Games as part of that. But it's probably the only time that I get excited or interested in traditional sport.
Yeah, I think that leads me really nicely onto my second question around hosting the Olympics in the midst of a pandemic, which we all know has been very, very controversial. And while we might be doing relatively well here in Aotearoa, many other countries are still ravaged by COVID. They're still recording thousands of deaths per day. So why have the Tokyo Games gone ahead in this context? And if we look at the history of the Olympics, the Olympics have been cancelled in the past with World War I and World War II, but the IOC was putting a lot of pressure on the Tokyo Organising Committee to host the Games, despite surveys showed between 70 and 80% of the Japanese people not wanting the Olympics to go ahead because of the risk and burden that it would likely bring to them and their country. And we're not seeing it necessarily so much in the media, but groups of the Japanese public are actively protesting during the Games. And without the tourists and the ticket sales, Japan's actually going to be losing approximately $1.8 billion from hosting the Games. One of our colleagues who works in the US, Professor Jules Boykoff, is a leader in critical Olympic studies, and he talks about the Olympics and that the public pays but the private profit. And this seems more true in the Tokyo Olympics than ever before. So hosting the Games during a pandemic is very risky business, with some benefiting more than others. So I'd like to go back to the audience to see, hands up, how many of you think the Tokyo Olympics should be going ahead despite the fact that we're still in the midst of a pandemic? Hands up, you think we should be? All right, interesting. Thank you. So back to our panel now, seeing that audience kind of response might sway you a little bit, but probably not. What are your thoughts on hosting the Olympics during a pandemic? What are the pros and cons, the power and politics involved in this decision?
Do you want me to go? Do you want to go?
No, you go.
We've got a few critical sociologists on the panel here, so.
Look, I've been studying with Holly and the Olympics for the last 10 years. It's been it's a big interest, and so I can only take the perspective of a critical sociologist, and that would be to say that in every Games there are winners and losers, but behind that, as you said, with these webs of power, and at the end of the day, for the IOC, this is a way of making money. They make over 70% of their profit by broadcasting rights. So from the IOC's perspective, it's vital the Games goes ahead, and it doesn't matter if there are no spectators. So they're the big winners here. They also don't have to pay for any of the additional costs that COVID have caused. All of that is left to Japan. So that seems to be a pretty unfair situation. So the Japanese people, to me, are the losers. Every Games for the last, right back through history, has cost the host country huge amounts. It hasn't made a profit. Most of the legacy claims, such as it will increase sporting participation in those countries, hasn't happened. The London Games is a great example of that. That was their big claim, right? So the Japanese people, I really feel for them. They don't want these Games. They've made it really clear. The doctors are saying this could be a spreader event. I don't know how the athletes feel. I guess I'd say they're broadly in the category of the winners, but they are a very small group of people relative to the number of people around the world that have been impacted by COVID. So I'm definitely in the camp that I think this is all about making money, and I don't think it should have gone ahead.
Anyone else like to add to that, extend upon that, challenge that?
No, I totally agree with you, Belinda. I think I read somewhere this week that in the running of the Games, while there's the host city has a contract, it's the IOC that ultimately has power over whether or not that goes ahead. Yeah. And I understand that there's been extreme pressure for that to go ahead. I think if we were to look inwardly at the Olympics and the Paralympics, I think athlete welfare is a very real concern. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're a privileged few, and yes, they have access to healthcare and testing, but I think we need to ensure that those athletes are protected. I think also there's concerns as well about the integrity of the events. There's a very long list of athletes in either the Paralympics or the Olympics that are absent from these games. So whether or not it is truly the fastest, the highest, the strongest is up for debate. And so that's kind of where I sit on it.
I might kick in with just because I can, a slightly different perspective, that I don't think any games, certainly in my lifetime, has not had some sort of controversy associated with it. And I can go back to lots of people getting killed in Mexico in 1968, and you can troll all the way through Zika virus and company. So the context of the Olympics has always been a platform for discussion as to what's going on in society, and then the sporting event, and in this case it's the Olympics every 4 years or 5 years in this case. I think the conversation I've heard today is a little bit separate conversation. One is whether we should have Olympic Games that cost the country a lot of money in a false economy sense, the commercial reality of it, versus whether it should be run during a pandemic. I think they are quite different conversations. I think the proof will be in the pudding at the back end of it, because I think we're all playing a guessing game as to what will be the consequence of hosting in a high-risk environment the pandemic, the Olympics. Dr. Bruce Hamilton's across there with the New Zealand team, pretty highly regarded doctor, and he said that without doubt he feels very confident that our athletes are safe in that environment. Dave Gerard came out, for some of you will know Dr. Dave Gerard from Otago University, came out this week strongly in support of the interventions that they have in place in terms of protecting athlete wellbeing. All of that will play out in the future because we don't really know what's in front of us. So I think in the context of that, we should unpack the debate into whether the Olympics has had its day versus whether an event, whether it's world war, whether it's pandemic, whether it's potential viruses, whether it's terrorism, as to whether an event, in this case the Olympics, should carry on. I'm betwixt, personally, at a moral level. I certainly was a month ago. But the more I see and the more I hear, I think the world is getting back into a new normal, and it's perhaps our New Zealand way of looking at things which are compromising our view of the pandemic and the Olympics.
Thanks, Jeff. I think watching from the television screen and knowing Dr. Bruce Hamilton, I'm sure it looks like as many precautions that could be taken are being taken. It does raise another kind of interesting question, though, as athletes around the world. I think 15% of the athletes in Tokyo are not vaccinated, which tells us that 85% are vaccinated. And so in many countries, the athletes have been prioritised to be vaccinated so they can go and represent the country, which does raise some quite interesting kind of questions around our priorities and vaccination schemes around the world in terms of prioritising healthy athletes to go travel, often over the more vulnerable groups in our communities. Does anyone have any thoughts on that kind of ethical, moral dilemma? We justify it, it's been justified, but I guess it brings us to the question of how important is sport in our society? How important is it in times of pandemic? Is it more important?
I think so. Yeah, I think that sport has the power to unite communities. We've all suffered this pandemic, and it's been horrific. It's horrible. Warranted that New Zealand hasn't been as affected as the rest of the world, which I think we should embrace. But I think that sport brings people together, and I think that whilst this Olympics is somewhat of an opiate because of the pandemic that's over-looming, but in saying that, people get excited, and I think that I feel for the athletes. I know a bunch of the athletes that are competing as well, and they've worked damn hard to try and peak at the right time. And last year they were ready, and now they've had to re-peak, which is, as an athlete, is so hard because you invest so many hours. There's that side as well. But I do absolutely understand that. Hey, we're in a pandemic. But I believe this Olympics is about human spirit, and I think that this brings the world together in some shape, where we can, for a moment, focus on these amazing athletes and support them and look at the wonderful work that they've done to perform out on the world stage. So yeah, and in terms of the vaccination choice thing, was that kind of so I mean, I think as an athlete you would do what you need to do to be able to compete at your best when you've put so much time and money into competing.
That raises quite an interesting paradox when you consider the Paralympics, where we know that COVID has exacerbated many health inequities among the disabled community, yet for those who are in talent ID pathways, talent development pathways, performance pathways, they're now being fast-tracked and have access to vaccinations based on their status as elite athletes. So in many ways it can be quite empowering in that sense. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, really.
It's sort of got, I think we have to be, certainly none of my athletes who are in the pathway of being vaccinated. So I'm lucky that I have 35 athletes at the Olympics who have been and all have chosen to be vaccinated. So I think that we've got to put in context about how many athletes from New Zealand have been vaccinated relative to the population being vaccinated. And I think the public good, this is part of the conversation that you're raising, the public good of, and there'll be different views in the audience based on the number of hands that were up before, the public good associated with seeing our athletes, the nationalism that we might get from it, or some of us get from it, is weighed up against the fact that we might have 500 roughly, maybe 600 New Zealanders being vaccinated in Tokyo right now. So the percentage of our population potential being vaccinated is a relatively small amount, as is a sidebar issue around when our athletes come back and they're in MIQ and in a privileged position that they get MIQ places. They are occupying a very small percentage of the government allocation of MIQ spaces. So again, inflated figures around how big a proportion of the population are being impacted either through MIQ and or injections are, I think they're overstated a little bit.
Okay, this it's kind of been mentioned by your add to that, Linda?
Oh, if that's okay. I was just going to say that there was a big international survey that the results came out last week, and in fact I was with the sport media class this week looking at it. So 22 countries, and although Japan was the country that least wanted the Games, surprisingly, in the majority, at least 60% of the population thought that the Games shouldn't be going ahead, which I was surprised. And it would be interesting to see after the Games if it has made people feel better and they do think it was the right thing. And just as an aside, in my class, so people that are interested in sport, a third thought that it should, a third thought it shouldn't, and a third were pretty unsure. But for me, I think that the issue about the athletes having dedicated their lives to this is really important. But the counterpoint would be, we have doctors in Tokyo pleading with the government, saying that we cannot manage the health situation here and we cannot have anything else to make this get worse. And their voice is not getting the same, I don't think, airing in the media as it's easy to get behind athletes and get excited and feel their passion, but doctors working in hospitals who have been dealing with this pandemic for a long time are so worn down.
And it's quite common to most Olympics. Leading up to it, we hear all the controversies and people are protesting, and there's often lots of debate and discussion. As soon as the opening ceremonies and then the sporting events begin, all of that kind of gets muted by a lot of the media, and the narrative kind of changes and we shift our attention. So I think I might transition us to the next question, which picks up some of the things that Mihi and Jeff have just mentioned, and hopefully Ellen, you can come in on this. But the postponement of the Games and the impact that's had on those athletes, as well as the sort of logistics for sports organisations like Growing New Zealand and many others across the country and around the world. I'd be really interested to hear some of your comments on the sort of what have been the impacts on athletes and sort of the psychology of the COVID Olympics. I mean, obviously being there in that environment with no spectators, all those additional stresses of masking and social distancing. while trying to be in your peak performance and representing your country. And then obviously the quarantine period, and often we talk about athletes having a post-Olympic blues. Will that be amplified when they're in quarantine and having 2 weeks to not be surrounded by family and just be able to go over and over and over what happened in their heads? Just kind of keen to flesh out sort of the psychology for athletes and the postponed games.
Yeah, I can touch on that. I think, I've had first-hand experience on being heavily impacted by the postponement of the games. Like you said, am a part of the New Zealand Women's Endurance Squad, so track cycling squad. So got to see firsthand how different people dealt with the situation. It's obviously an unforeseen event that it was postponed. It's not something that an athlete can mentally and physically prepare for with the flip of a switch. 365 days is a very long time to keep training for an event that you're actually uncertain will actually happen. And I think, you definitely saw true characters coming out during that time that was obviously too long for a lot of people. A lot of people used the lockdown as a reflection time and retired early. Obviously you have to sacrifice a lot for a whole year and for the Olympics, and that was obviously a lot for a lot of people. I can probably talk on development athletes and the impact it had on them. So with my story, like when the selection first came out in 2020, I was happy with my position. I knew I didn't deserve to be in that Olympic team at that time when the postponement came out. As a development athlete, it was the best news ever, because for me that was another whole year that I could train and prove to myself and to Cycling New Zealand that I was good enough to be in that team in a year's time. So that's exactly what I did, train my ass off for months and months and months. And then the selection policy came out saying that the original team that would have been sent to 2020 will be the team that is sent to the 2021 games also, which was a pretty tough pill to swallow. I think, and that has probably happened for a lot of development athletes as well. That was pretty hard. I guess for the athletes as well, going to the games, it's just a really long time to have to train for, especially for cyclists that train usually chasing summers. Another whole winter in New Zealand, especially turns into Groundhog Day when you're at the track and running out on the road for 3 hours every morning. So, I think definitely a double-edged sword with that one.
Thanks for that perspective. I think it is really helpful to imagine what it's been like for those athletes trying to prepare for such uncertainty.
I think there's a whole lot of perspectives that our balance sheet is a whole lot better because we couldn't run a European campaign, so you can always look at it from a banker's perspective. I think the biggest impact on the athletes are going to be the short turnaround between Tokyo and Paris. I think without doubt there was a lot of learning, there was a lot of resilience, coaches and athletes. We just shouldn't focus on athletes. I think the coaches found the COVID period really difficult in their own sense because they had no serious ways of establishing whether we were tracking well relative to the Europeans, which is what we would normally get out of the European summer and all those sorts of things. So there was all those sort of factors that came into it. But for me, the learning upside will be far greater than the loss in terms of resilience and adaptability and flexibility, those sorts of things. So if I look at it as positive, the real challenge for athletes will be a very, very short turnaround between the washout of Tokyo and decision making around retirement and High Performance Sport New Zealand government investing in high performance. We won't know that until late December, early January. So we really only have 18 months to Paris. Longer term, the impact of the pandemic, I think, will be more about Paris than Tokyo.
Now I've got another question that has come from Slido, come from the audience, which I think kind of builds on this athlete experience. And I saw something published, I think it was today, around we've all heard about the heat, right? But I think the impact the heat in Tokyo is having on the athletes, and I think the study that I saw, or the article I saw, was around Tokyo may have not been completely honest around the potential heat and the impacts on athletes. So the question I have here is, I would like to know the panel's opinion on the wisdom of the Olympics taking place on the height of the Japanese summer when it can be dangerously hot.
So I'll kick off really quickly, because when I first started in rowing New Zealand, I was getting the health and safety tour, and one of the coaches dragged me into the heat chamber. That was a pretty rustic affair at Kaupapa. And they were training at that stage in 91% humidity and roughly 33 degrees, so they monitored all the way through. So I think the athlete readiness, I think, compensated, because it's not that hot really, if you cut to it around preparation. And some athletes are suffering in the heat. It was really interesting, going back to an earlier conversation, the commercial reality of the Olympics, and the fact that we have two of our swimmers who, I won't go into the reasons why they don't, but they're swimming in the morning, their finals, so they can be broadcast in the United States. And so we're compromising performance against commercial reality, because the TV audience in the US is a dominant audience from the commercial reality. So I think some of those things are probably more detrimental to athlete wellbeing, mental wellbeing, because they're not able to compete at their best, and that's not heat related. That's scheduling and commercial reality. So there's all sorts of things that go on, but our athletes aren't complaining about the heat. They quite enjoy it relative to what they have here.
Rob, do you have any comments on that with the Paralympics and the heat issue?
Yeah, I think it highlights some of the inequity or the lack of distribution of resources across certain sports in certain countries. You know, all the well-funded, well-resourced sports will prepare well for heat, they'll go through heat acclimation, they'll have access to heat chambers. Whereas for athletes with certain impairments, heat creates a different response, a detrimental response to performance. So for athletes who potentially don't have access to those resources, those exercise physiology support, heat acclimation, then yeah, they're going into a bit of a sauna without very much practice. So yeah, it's just not everyone has access to the preparation that would allow them to perform at their best. So yeah, that's what I think.
It's a really interesting point, thank you. Now I'm going to transition to the next one, because it does connect with one of the questions from Slido. So the Tokyo Olympics have been quite controversial around a range of new policies, including gender categories, as we've seen in the case of New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard. And it's important to clarify in beginning this conversation that Laurel has legally qualified to compete in the plus 87 kg Olympic women's weightlifting category, but her inclusion has triggered a lot of debate across this country and around the world. And I should note that we did invite our amazing research expert in transgender health, Dr. Jamie Veal, to join us today. Unfortunately, she couldn't due to prior commitments. But I've had the pleasure of working with Jamie quite a lot over recent weeks, as we've both responded to an array of media queries about Hubbard's inclusion in the Olympics. But I'm really interested in what the panel thinks about the situation, which has obviously been very, very controversial over recent weeks, and it's not going to stop after the Olympics.
I'll jump in here. So yeah, when I know Laurel, and I knew her before she transitioned, because I've been in weightlifting for quite some time. So I was quite protective, I suppose, of her when people started attacking her when she was given an opportunity to compete. So personally, I was torn because I knew her, and then in the same instance, I heard another story from Tracy Lambrix, who I also know, and she told her personal experience about how she was affected. She's been competing in weightlifting. Tracy has been competing in weightlifting for over 10 years, and she was the top in New Zealand for her weight and class category. And she got a phone call and said, okay, all your records have been broken. If you want to keep competing at this weight class, then you'll need to drop weight and go into a different class category, because Laurel's just broken all your records. So as an individual athlete and thinking, oh my gosh, as a female, knowing that this has happened, I feel a bit torn as well. So it is a bit of a difficult thing to discuss. But in saying that, Laurel is a person and transgender, are people, they are humans, and I believe that they should be respected. And I don't think it's their fault at all. I believe that it needs to be the organising committee that should put things in place where females, such as myself, who may compete against someone who is clearly going to be way stronger than I am. But I think that, for me, I think that this structure needs to be put in place to protect them, but also to protect the females. So I don't know, I'm a bit torn here. I really am torn. I see both sides, but I kind of, I suppose, sit in the middle, and I think that the Olympic Committee needs to make the decision and have maybe a separate category for transgender women where they get awarded. They still compete with everyone, but they get a different award. That's my perspective on it, though. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that some of the social conversations that we're having across the world, and trans and sexuality is not a new conversation, but I guess we go back to Carla Smith raising the first 400 metre running race, and we started to represent really ethnic challenges in it. We now have the transitioning athletes, and we know that there are two at the Olympics. We're very, very silent in New Zealand. The fact that there's a Canadian footballer who's has transitioned, sorry. So, I think the sport is dealing with things which society is really struggling with, and we're not equipped. I'm not equipped at Row New Zealand. We actually have a transition male with female athlete, but because the person doesn't row particularly well, with all due respect to that person, then it's not front page of the newspaper. So we're just not equipped, I don't think, to deal with some of those social challenges at a personal level, and this is very ill-informed, so I hope not to offend anyone. I still find it very, very interesting that the majority of cases that we're hearing about in a sporting environment are male to female transitioning. And I'm concerned about equity for the people who are on the other side of the ledger. So we need to protect both sides of the balance sheet, for want of a better term, both sides of the equation, to ensure that everyone's participating in a fairly safe and fair environment. So I just don't think sport is ready for those conversations yet, but they're in front of us.
Yeah, and it's definitely going to stay in front of us. I think there's one more transgender athlete at the Olympics, which is an American BMX rider who's in the substitute team. So I think you're right, though. What we're seeing brought to the fore through sport are bigger social issues around our understandings of gender, and we've got to think about the history of sport, which actually has this long history of being based on a binary understanding of gender. But in many parts of society, whether it's in education and schools and the workplace, we're trying to recognise that gender isn't just a binary anymore. So sport some parts of sport are working to reflect that, and I can see it's very controversial and difficult for a lot of people, but it's interesting to see sports organisations trying to lead here, and I think it's been really important to see Kerry Smith, New Zealand Olympic Committee, really being very clear. This is a culture of respect and diversity, and the team should follow and respect that, and I think that's showing some interesting signs of leadership. But anything else, Belinda?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the comments that are made in the sense that it's a really difficult issue and there isn't a simple solution, and that is because sport is based on a male-female binary, and transgender, challenges that, and we also know in sport we've become increasingly aware of women like Caster Semenya, who is different, a different situation, but equally she doesn't neatly fit in terms of physiology. She has, difference of sexual development, and her testosterone does not fit what the international athletics governing bodies consider to be the right amount for a female. And so I think international sport is going to have to actually get up to speed more quickly. The research is still limited, and it's still complex, and we don't, it seems, really know to what extent naturally produced testosterone in women who have differences of sexual development, to what extent that gives them an advantage. There's conflicting evidence, in the same way that we don't know for transgender women the advantage of height through puberty, etc. So we do need research, and that's really important. But I guess it must be so hard for those individual athletes, and we know that some of them are leaving sport because of it. I don't know if you're aware of the North American skateboarder Leo Baker, who was selected for the US women's skateboard team, and she was in the process of transitioning to become Leo, and decided that the rules of the drugs and the limits that sport would put on him was too much, and he kind of dropped out. So, that's quite a big deal, I think, thinking about the welfare of people and the ability to identify themselves in a different way that at the moment the Olympics is not able to do.
It's really interesting how so much of the conversation focuses around testosterone.
Yeah.
And the levels of testosterone from birth and through the teenage years, but really performance is so much more than how many nanomoles of testosterone you've had. Bodies come in all shapes and sizes, different countries and how much they can invest in their athletes and opportunities, the training facilities that they can have. I mean, sport is never a level playing field, right? So I think it's interesting that we focus so much on testosterone, and if we unpack that further as these kind of deeply ingrained assumptions around sport, men being better at sport, and so therefore men who have transitioned to women are therefore cheating, or trying to cheat the system. So there's so much we can unpack in this, and it really is it's a moment that we need to keep talking and learning, because it's not a finished conversation, and obviously we need to centralise the voices and experiences of those from the transgender community, but unfortunately many have been silenced in this conversation because of so much online abuse that they've been experiencing, and Laurel has been subjected to so much of that. So I think as an athlete and a human being, we should be really proud of not only being at the Olympics, but having to overcome so much difficulty in her life, and the amount of abuse that's out there right now is pretty disheartening to see that that's part of our country, really. But beyond Laurel, we've seen a whole lot of other controversies around women in sport, around uniforms, around drug testing, with the US track athlete Sha'Carri Richardson testing positive for marijuana. We've seen female athletes excluded for high testosterone levels. We've seen the German gymnastics team wearing the full leotards as a way to protest the sexualisation of gymnasts' bodies. There's a lot going on in this space. Does anyone want to pick this up and run with it, explore it, and use the sporting metaphors that
How good that it's happening. That would be my perspective. There was another issue not long ago in a beach volleyball tournament when the Norwegian girls refused to wear the bikini setup that they were supposed to wear, and decided to wear the comparable thing to the men's uniform. Some would say it's taken too long for the athletes to express their rights as humans to dress appropriately or whatever they're trying to do. So again, athletes are taking the lead in their own environment now, and taking their own accountabilities, and perhaps giving the bird to officials who still are in a very traditional and unfortunately male biased world. So I think it's in my previous gig, I had the good fortune to lead the diversity and inclusion team at Sport New Zealand. So we start to talk about the rights of the disabled people, the gender equity, and those conversations. So I just think it's refreshing that athletes are taking ownership.
And challenging the rules and regulations.
In the old fast like that.
And wish it would have happened sooner. Well, I guess it identifies a whole system that is built off athlete labour, where they don't get to make the call. Yet, who are we watching at the Olympics who are we excited about? All of that is built off them, but they often don't get to make those choices themselves, which is pretty rough.
Anyone else have a comment on?
I mean, I find the marijuana testing absolutely fascinating. You know, there's no observable from what I hear. There's no observable performance benefit to marijuana other than potentially reduction of anxiety or performance. And I suspect that the outcry on the back of Sha'Carri Richardson is that it will probably be removed off the in-competition wider list, just because of the time and expense taken to test for it and then catch those individuals who are doing it. I would suspect in that individual case, and she mentioned that it was to do with recent loss and dealing with that. The question would then be, you know, what's the wraparound support for her as an athlete? You know, you are an elite athlete with a peak of performance. You know that it's on the in-competition list. Who is in her ear saying, now's not the time? And so for me that begs wider questions, but I suspect the outcry from it will mean that it's removed.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion, the critical discussion around this is the sort of the policing and regulating of not only women's bodies but brown and black women's bodies, who are often those that are the most policed and regulated by sports organisations. Does anyone want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really goes back to the previous sort of question or discussion around women like Caster Semenya. I read in the newspaper this week that there were 2 teenagers from Namibia who ended up not going to the Olympics. One was a 400-metre runner, I'm not sure about the other. Both of them were found that their testosterone levels were too high to be considered a real woman. Both of them had no idea they had high testosterone, nor did their coaches, nor did their families. They weren't coming from wealthy countries where they had the benefit of some of the testing and so on that would happen in other places. So, you know, 2 young women who were up there with the potential to be winning medals. And these rules are not being applied in ways that are equal and fair, and there's been a lot of debate about how it is women, particularly from Africa and India, who've been targeted through these rules. You know, and it feeds into, I think, these wider critiques of the Olympic movement that have been going on for a very long time, that it is still run by a bunch of old white dudes, basically. You know, they're incredibly unaccountable. It's only recently that they changed the rules so that you had to retire after the age of 80. You know, it's come down now to 70 or 60. But
From the IOC.
From the IOC.
Not the athletes.
Not the athletes. You know, the old dudes that are running it. And most of these are, it's grace and favour how they get onto these committees. I mean, a lot of them are not there because they've been top in sport, or they're top coaches. It's actually still the minority that come from the international federation. So I think it's difficult to unpack these questions without recognising who has the power to set the agendas. And the women's volleyball example, I mean, I agree with you, it's great that they're now getting visibility for these concerns, but I mean, we've been hearing about women's volleyball hating their uniforms from day one. You know, that and the players say, well, why do we have to wear these stupid up the bum kind of things that we can't play in when the men get to wear shorts? Like, why?
And this Games is touted as the gender parity Games, right? That is the overriding message from it. So potentially it is the platform for those female athletes to speak out.
And that's great, but for me, it's too little, too late, and it shouldn't be those athletes that have to change things. It should be these white dudes in power.
Yeah, there's 2 sides, not so I fully agree, by the way, about the old white plants anyway, but who are running the show. But I guess again we're talking about change, and just as in our own workplace, if the person at the head table is not doing the job that you think they should, the workforce rebels and the nurses go out on strike or whatever it happens to be. So the Olympics, any sport today that sits on TV is a commercial reality, and the primary owner of the property is the athletes. If the All Blacks don't play, the rugby union goes broke. And so the power sits with the athletes, and the sooner the power is exercised and they build the confidence to do that, and increasingly you're starting to see that across codes with player associations and all sorts of dynamics happening. Ultimately, the commercial power sits with the athletes.
I think it comes back a little bit to Damien's point though. Historically, athletes have not been encouraged to speak up. There's that athlete labour and basically shut up and play. You're not supposed to be political, you're not supposed to challenge the rules and regulations. But what we are seeing, I think, is an interesting moment in time, and that social change perhaps is being sped up in sports because athletes are having a voice. And technologies are playing a really important part in that, in terms of social media. They're getting support from international audiences and from their fellow athletes. And so actually, sometimes they might have had a voice and they've complained, and often they haven't been heard, or they've been silently dropped from the team and silenced in lots of different ways within the system. By using social media, a lot of athletes some of them have huge, multi-million followings, and they're working together to try to bring these issues to the fore. There's a long way to go though.
But the IOC is scared of that, right? Because they've imposed rules on the athletes about what they can and can't protest about. All the athletes had to sign to say that they wouldn't use their Olympic platform for political purposes. Political, and that could be a whole range of things. Yeah.
I think just to speak on that as well, I have a teammate, Kirsty James. She put in a petition because at the moment with track cycling, in a team pursuit you have a team of 5, and in the actual race itself you ride 4 people, and there's but you can swap in that 5th rider. So in a final there will only be 4 people on the track, and in the medal presentation only 4 people get medals. So if that 5th rider rode the qualifying but didn't ride the final, they won't get a medal. So it's not really that controversial. It's not like a huge topic like the transgender or anything like that, but a petition was started for that 5th person to get a medal, and it was signed by thousands and thousands of cyclists all over the world and went all the way up to the IOC. And for a topic that should not be that hard to change, the IOC just slammed it shut. So I think there is power in athletes to speak up, but how far that message can get should be questioned. And
very good.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I might transition to another question now. We are seeing, we've heard already tonight, some of the things that some of our panellists are most excited about are some of these new sports, these youth-focused sports like surfing and skateboarding and sport climbing and BMX freestyle at the Olympic Games. And I think the surfing finals are on right now. Not at all torn. And in Paris 2024 we're going to see breakdancing or breaking, and we're going to see kite surfing, and Belinda and I have obviously been researching this for a decade or so now, and we know it's much more than about bringing the youth audiences in, although that's a big part of it. It's also about trying to respond to critiques of the Olympics as being elitist. They're trying to bring in sports that are more participatory, trying to bring in more urban sports. We're seeing basketball 3-on-3. So we're seeing some changes happening to the program. The IOC trying to be a bit more flexible and responding to changing ways that people are participating in and consuming sport. I'd be really interested to hear from the panel in terms of what you think about these new sports in the Olympics, and what it's sort of signposts in terms of sports organisations like the IOC trying to do things differently, or is it more of the same, forced into the same package?
I think some people will be coming to that question in the audience or in general around, are those sports even sports?
Absolutely.
And I would be arguing against that type of perspective. But it's funny, they're actually the sports I'm the least interested in at the Olympics. I was sneaking a look at some gymnastics, believe it or not, during work today. And I'm more interested in the traditional sports and what's happening within those spaces at the Olympic Games. But I guess because I know the history of how those sports have come to be at the Olympic Games, and some of those sports, and not just the current ones that are entering into Tokyo, but all of the action sports that exist within the Olympic Games, Summer and Winter Games, except for climbing and surfing, none of them have entered off the back of their own organisation. They've been subsumed by a bigger organisation, an existing one that is already buddies with the AOC. Some want to be in the games, they want that profile and what they think might come from being in that space, but not all of them do. The petitions that existed for skateboarding not to be in the Olympics, and again, no recognition of what that means, and someone else gets to make the decision, because ultimately it is about participation and views and therefore money for the broadcasting. So I don't mind that I have not been contributing to the viewership of the action sports at the Olympic Games. But yeah, I guess my personal interaction into that space makes me really upset with the fact that they have that platform. Not because I have anything against any of those activities, and I love them outside of the games, but with the same sort of things happening with parkour, in the sense of another bigger body, which is the International Gymnastics Federation, claiming parkour as their active gymnastic discipline, despite our national federations not having the opportunity to have a voice in that space, and just saying, well, we're going to do it, would you like to work with us and make it happen, because it'll be so exciting, you get to be at the Olympics. And most people don't know about those things behind the scenes. They just get to see it on TV and decide whether they think they like it or not.
You've had a pretty unique perspective with Parkour Earth, which you're now CEO of, and the battle between Parkour Earth and the international parkour community, and FIG, and the whole kind of campaign of we are not gymnastics, and that wrestle over power over who controls and defines the future of this sport. And I guess, as you're saying, we've seen similarities in skateboarding in some of the other sports.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Belinda? Sure, you've got something to say on this.
Oh my goodness. There's so much that can be said. I think probably the most relevant thing for me is, having spent this past 10 years looking at the history of these sports, being able to speak to athletes, being able to speak to the international federations, and also speaking to the IOC as well, and watching how things have happened and changed over time, I'm more and more of a skeptic. And I think the IOC has brought these sports in to try to address the ageing US audience in particular, which for the last couple of games has been around age 50, which might surprise some people.
Quite young. Sorry.
50 young. And they realise that their product is just not as popular as it was, and they've got to do something about it to change. They're also making a great deal about the gender equity, and how they really, want to have 50% of the competitors being women, and we're very close to it in Tokyo, and these new sports have been part of that. But then we go and look at what we've just been talking about, the management of these international federations and the IC themselves. In most of them, they don't get near even the 20%, well, not most, that's not true, but in many, that the IC are recommending 20% of the board should be women. And these sports organisations are some of the most male-dominated organisations in the world. Companies tend to have much higher numbers of women on the board. So if the IC was really serious, I think they would be pushing a bit harder in terms, for example, in coaching, in leadership. So I think it's a performance, and this is, I guess, what we say in the book, is that they're using these new sports as a way to try to demonstrate that they are, moving with the times, and there's lots of complex things that come from that. And I think there'll be some great winners, and as I said, I think the women's skateboarding is amazing, and that, I think, it will be really beneficial for skateboarding as a culture, because women have been really, really underrepresented in professional skateboarding. They've had no sponsorship, very little prize money, very little opportunity, and this is really going to help women who are skateboarders. But it's not going to happen everywhere. In New Zealand, we do not have any athletes, and that's not because we don't have good skateboarders. The ones that were good went off to Australia because it became really clear really quickly that there was not a penny of money that was going to come to skateboarding in New Zealand in the first 2 years. and they've had a tiny amount of money in the last year, and there's no commitment for the next games yet. And surfing has had a bit of money, but very little. So there's lots of reasons for that, and I can speak to that. But the politics of this a lot better than I can. But budgets, they have to be determined over time, and there's lots of other sports out there that are also, why not us? Squash has been trying to get into the Olympics for a very long time. Very high participation sport, but it's not great TV, so it's just not going to get a place. That's the reality.
Belinda's point about culture in terms of skateboarding and those beneficial opportunities that come through that visibility of the sport. On the flip side, the thing that is attractive to those action sports and as a participant around the culture of what that it feels like to be part of a non-traditional action sport, alternative sport, whatever language you want to use, that as a draw card is one of the reasons why the Olympics wants those sports to be in the games. But in order to make it fit that mould, you strip a lot of that culture away to make it fit that program. I don't know a great deal of climbers personally, but the model within climbing is something that never existed, and they brought all those things together. I guess I take Jeff's point about the athletes having that say in terms of if you don't show up, it doesn't exist. But in our experience with parkour and gymnastics, they just paid all the athletes to come. It wasn't even, their first things weren't real competitions, they were showcases. It's very hard to make an ethical stand when you're getting free flights and free food and free hotel bookings. And so all the initial athletes, once they discovered what was happening with gymnastics, pulled out. But then the second tier all said yes, and came too. And then by being able to participate, it slowly starts chipping away at all of the things that the kind of core community holds dear.
And I think it's in Tokyo, it's interesting too, because surfing and skateboarding and sport climbing and BMX freestyle, they were very much about this festival environment. That was the plan, where there was supposed to be elements of the culture there, there's supposed to be music, there's supposed to be, the audience is supposed to be able to have a go, there's supposed to be this vibe about it, this urban vibe in the park area there. But then without the COVID Olympics, without spectators, so much of that wasn't able to be realised. So we look at skateboarding at the Olympics, and many might say it stripped the culture of from the sport, but actually partly that was part of the bigger plan, but hasn't been able to be seen there. Jeff?
I think one of the interesting, and if we try to crystal ball going forward, a number of the sports that are coming into the Olympic program are what I would say are recreational activities that are becoming sport. Now, rowing has always been a sport. It's not a recreational activity. No one in their right mind would row on a 2K course for recreation. So it's always been a sport. So it's a fairly simple one. But surfing, the predominant surfing in New Zealand, if we look at stats, people, if you ask surfers what sport they play, they say, we don't surf, we don't play sport, we surf. We don't play sport, we skate. So the transitioning nature of a recreational activity, which kids have done outside, young people, so I shouldn't say kids, young people have done outside the auspices of rigor and rules and competition structures, and now becoming sports. It'll be really interesting to see how they transition and whether they uptake. The number of competitive surfers in New Zealand, you start to talk about grommets and some of those things, you only have 30 or 40 surfers at our nationals. So really understanding the challenge over time as to whether they grow as sports or whether they really are almost anti-culture and they want to stay in the recreational space.
And I think it'll be what we saw with snowboarding, for example, it's very similar and introduced in 1998, very controversial. And then we've got those that take the Olympic path, the sport version of snowboarding, but the majority of participants, it's very much recreational, and I'm sure we'll see the same thing in surfing and skateboarding and sport climbing, those that choose the Olympic pathway, but the majority, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and the majority will be recreational participants. But you're right, that is a big appeal for the IOC, is actually activities that people actually do in their everyday lives, these, what Belinda's termed, these lifestyle sports, because they're actually participation levels are quite high, but we don't know how to actually measure those because they're not going through our formal structures in sport which we measure.
They might measure it by how many surfboards get sold. So it may be a commercial reality for RSC. I mean, I'm a bit cynical, as others are. But the motivation may well be the untapped market around Billabong or whatever happens to be the manufacturer in terms of skate cultures that sell product, and that's why it's on TV, because it will sell a product.
Indeed, the industry have been quite involved in trying to get these sports in because they know there's an economic boost for them.
I was just going to say, it's funny though, it's almost like they've taken this sport, and exactly what Damon said, you know, they've taken the culture out of it. The way that I was watching the surfing and I was like, this isn't surfing. It just, it lacked culture, you know, and it felt like the sport was colonised, if I was, you know, in a way, because it was supposed to be a free thing that people go and experience and people watch it and you get stoked. There's this underground feeling that it was lacking, and I was thinking they could have changed the structure. You know, they had 20 of the top surfers in the world, and they could have taken them out on a boat and taken them out to some big surf to really showcase the sport. But I think they took the culture out of it, and the same with skateboarding. It's like, oh, this kind of felt cultureless, if I'm being honest. So I totally agree with you. Yeah.
I really want to know what happens afterwards. You know, Belinda brought up this, you know, the claims that exist around that have been challenged around the impact of participation post Olympics, and it's supposed to, you know, that was certainly big for London, you know, the legacy. But these activities occur in locations where whether there's necessary for infrastructure or just the existing environment, and what is going to happen to increase the support of those spaces. You know, with Parkour, we're really conscious that what happened with skateboarding was that councils went and built skate parks, and then skaters who were trying to skate in the city were told, well, no, we've built your park, go there and skate there. You know, and it's awesome that in Hamilton they've removed the bylaw for that stops central city skateboarding, which is great. But, you know, if the Olympic Games is meant to have this boom for cities that are hosting the Games, what is the opportunity for, you know, activity like skateboarding to then have a city council going, oh, this is wonderful, we're going to make it easier for you to skate throughout the entire city, or is it going to be focused on built infrastructure that segregates and isolates people into the spaces? And so with Parkour, we want to explore the world. You know, a purpose-built spaces are nice to have, but that's not our goal. But as soon as you take it and you put it into these purpose-built obstacles and spaces, what's the fallout that happens at the local level? And I'm not convinced that it would be great.
I'm going to twist this a little bit. Thank you, Damien. Very important points there around spaces and places. We should know that these new sports have not been included in the Paralympics. And I've got a question here, so I'm going to transition now into the Slido questions. Should we forget about the Paralympics altogether and just continue with this ableist perspective and dialogue?
No. Thank you for that. No, that is indicative of an ableist perspective, the privileging of able-bodied sports, competitions, mega events over the Paralympics. And in many respects, we might be at risk of that here, because the dialogue is very much on the Olympics with very little discussion of the Paralympics. Now, I suspect that's always the case. The Paralympics is always the younger sibling, if you like. It's always the disadvantaged cousin. And so, but what's interesting is we like to talk about the Paralympics in very superlative ways. So whilst the Paralympics is often left behind in terms of viewing and staging and all these things, we like to ramp up the discourse or the systems of language that we use to talk about disability and the Paralympics and how empowering and awesome the Paralympics is for disabled people. Well, there's not really that much evidence for that. And, you know, I think about, I'm going to go off on one here, sorry, I don't know how much time we've got.
Not much, and we've got so many great questions in here.
Okay, original question, no, we shouldn't forget about the Paralympics. That's an ableist perspective, thank you.
Some absolutely awesome questions here, thank you to our audience.
I am interested, just to hold on to it for a little bit, the conversation we've had about the Olympics relative to the Para, I'm in a really interesting dialogue that we had a chat about earlier at the moment around para rowing versus disabled people rowing, and they're quite different conversations. 20% of New Zealanders have a disability, but 20% of New Zealanders aren't eligible to row in para rowing. So if that makes sense, the conversation around inclusion is quite an interesting thing, whereas the Paralympics is actually quite exclusive from a disability perspective. So how we rationalise the debate we have about inclusion in say, gender equity or whatever it happens to be in the Olympics, I'm really looking forward to the social conversation around is para here to stay relative to disability sport and a more inclusive approach to disability.
Which transitions, sorry.
No, you go to the next one.
Transitions quite nicely, maybe we can continue some of this next question. What are the panel's views of athletes achieving, no, that's the wrong question. There is a continuing disconnect between high performance and grassroots. What can high performance sport do to raise the benefit of activity against poor health and vulnerability? I think we're kind of getting at that there a little bit in the disability and Paralympic issue in terms of high performance versus everyday community, physical activity, active recreation. Yeah. Are we going like this, or what do you think?
In the Paralympics, yes. So one of the things that particularly international media in the UK, they really ramp up around the superhumans. Okay, these are the athletes that we celebrate. They are, and it's a derivative of something we call the supercrit narrative, which is these amazing athletes who overcome their disability and achieve things that normal people with disabilities couldn't achieve. And it's always inspiring to an able-bodied audience. Look at these amazing disabled people who overcome their disabilities. What you tend to find is the disabled community do not in any way connect with that, because they do not face or have any of the same privileges that these athletes have. And for them to be active, they face a multitude of barriers, to, whether that be individual attitudes, i.e. I don't want to coach you, social barriers, i.e. stairs to a stage, or cultural barriers, disabled people don't belong in sport. And so the ways in which we talk about high performance disability sport is necessarily exclusive. It privileges those able disabled, and it excludes a whole swathe of people. We saw the Paralympian Becky Myers last week withdraw from the Paralympics because she was denied a personal carer. Mm-hmm. She's a deaf-blind athlete, what we would conceptualise as highly impaired. But the Paralympics privileges those who are what one of my PhD students would call the pretty Brits, the ones that don't look different from you and I. And so, the ways in which we talk about and valorise high-performance disability sport does not have the knock-on effect for the community and the disabled community and their access to sport.
I'd argue that elite sport has nothing to do with health. You want your athletes to be healthy to perform, but in that space, it's about you put your body on the line often to achieve the result that you want. And so there is quite a big disconnect between that and that grassroots experience. I never participated in any traditional sport or anything at an elite level, but I have broken multiple bones and concussions playing rugby. But I've been fitter and stronger than I've ever been through parkour, where I've just got to make my own decisions and I haven't had to compete against anyone else. So it's really hard to translate that into participation and into grassroots.
It's interesting. I spent, as I said briefly, I stay away from the rowing conversation because it is primarily performance-orientated sport. But the 8 years I spent at Sport New Zealand and a responsibility around growing physical activity really for New Zealanders, but through recreation and sport, relative to the high performance investment. So there was always a contestable conversation inside government as to how much and why we invest in high performance versus investing in basically physical activity. The outcomes are completely different. And so if we try and draw parallels to say, really we're dreaming, I think we've got enough global evidence now to go, high performance sport does not really influence physical activity in any sustained sort of way. So therefore we have to measure outcomes in a very, very different way. And so not looking at the Olympics to expect a knock-on effect into the physical activity of New Zealanders, because history tells us that won't happen. And so we start to look at why do we invest in high performance. It might be about nationalism, it might be about aspiration, it might be about social connectivity. You go down to the pub and watch the America's Cup, maybe not the Olympics, but go down and watch the swimming or the cycling or the surfing. There's a motivation here for government to invest in that, whereas over here there's the whole health and wellbeing outcomes that come from physical activity. So they're not apples and apples. So I think we should treat them in conversations quite separately.
Thank you. Got another great question here. The Olympics is criticised for its cost and environmental impact. What could or should change to address this? And if nothing changes, will the Olympics die out? I know Belinda's happy.
That's a great question. Part of the performance of Agenda 2020, this is the Olympics trying to show that they're in the 21st century is sustainability, and this is just complete corporate greenwashing. There's so much been written and shown about all the terrible decisions that are being made, but for me, the one that really strikes home is to do with surfing. And there was lots of debate in Tokyo whether surfing should be in a wave pool or in the ocean, and one of the arguments against the wave pool is the environmental cost. And then, once surfing was announced in Paris, there was lots of debate. Would it be a wave pool? Would it be in the southwest France beaches? No, it's going to be in Tahiti. So the International Olympic Committee are going to fly, or the National Olympic Committee fly all their athletes to Tahiti to compete. Then they're going to fly them all the way back to Paris for the opening and closing ceremonies. I'm sorry, but that is not a decision that an institution vaguely worried about their carbon footprint could make. I think it's just hot air, no. And I think, yes, to answer the question, it is one of the things that is going to show even more the crisis that the IOC faces in its brand and how it's going to manage it. All mega events really are problematic when we think about the environmental
The flying of athletes and coaches and support teams to parts of the world and flying them all home again, the environmental impact of these events, as well as the tourism and the facilities.
We could go on and on.
Huge footprints.
It'd be quite interesting in a few years' time, the track cycling event in Brisbane, Tuesday in Brisbane, will actually be done in the garage via Swift.
Yeah, that's right.
So you won't have to travel. Now there'll still be a carbon footprint associated with that, but eventually, I guess that's where it's interesting how this will evolve the conversation into how we actually play sport going forward. Now it may not be in the immediate future, but again, the adaptations that will need to be made, that will take it to the extreme. People won't need to get together to participate. They'll be on an growing.
There's definitely a whole movement around the future of the Olympics being virtual games. That's right.
Esports. No one's mentioned esports yet.
No, I'm surprised.
So I want to thank the audience for those very engaging questions. There are a lot more. I couldn't get through them all, but thank you. And thank you for our panellists for responding to those excellent questions. I do want to, before we say our farewells, acknowledge the university contributions to the Games. I'm not sure if you know this, but we have an incredible group of our current and recent Sir Edmund Hillary scholars competing at the Games. And they, as Sir Edmund Hillary scholars here, their athletic and their academic pursuits are supported when they study with us. And I think we've got Greg O'Carroll in the audience, who's our high performance student scholarship manager, who plays a really key role in supporting these athletes and pursuing and achieving all their hopes and dreams. Also, we have a number of our postgraduate students and our staff who played key roles in doing research to support the health and wellbeing and performances of athletes and teams attending the Games. So I'd just like, maybe we could put our hands together for our University of Waikato contributions to the Games. So, and just in closing, I want to thank our amazing panellists for sharing their insights and wisdom with us tonight. It's been a real treat. I've really enjoyed it. I've heard many different perspectives, from athlete perspectives, sports administrators, sports leaders, and obviously critical academics. And I hope the conversation tonight gives you all something to think about as you go out into your evening and you either watch the Games or you choose not to over the following weeks. So on that note, good night and have a safe journey home. Ka kite ana, haere rā.